Okay, welcome to the next lecture in 289-106 Introduction to Game Technologies. This lecture is entitled Who Am I? And it poses the question, who are you? Now, on sort of a existential basis, I don't have the answers to that, but we're really asking the question, who are you in terms of being a player, and a player especially in character-driven narrative-based games. So in prior lectures, we spoke a little bit about interactivity and how interactivity is predicated on the idea of choice. And that choice offers the player agency, and that agency allows you to be you. Your choices inform the way the game gets played, and that's kind of a critical element to games as opposed to most other types of media. Now, in ye old days, the idea of you was fairly basic and fairly straightforward. In old text-based adventures, it explicitly said, "You do this, you see this, you seem to hear from the southwest the sounds of the sea," and it was common to just be able to place yourself into the game quite easily. However, since then, we have games that have a visual representation of self, where we actually get to see the player and some sort of visual representation of that player, which by default kind of becomes a visual representation of your agency, of the choices that you make. So that this lecture might need to be divided up into 2 or 3 lectures, as exploring this idea of the sense of self in gameplay. Just to get our kind of terminology aligned, I want to talk about the different types of points of view in game. The first one would be abstract, non-specific viewpoint. Games like Tetris is a classic example. There isn't an indication of a player. A lot of abstract games will not have this idea of a representation of self in the game. But this also pertains to text-based adventures and other adventures where, even though there is a sense of self, that self has no visual representation. It's abstract. Then you have a God's eye view. God's eye view is probably best described through games like Civilization, and it's this idea of being able to see a vast gameplay and to make choices and have visual representation of those choices. But there isn't necessarily the sense of a person playing. In Civilization, you might have a portrait, but there's no indication of what that character looks like as you are playing the particular game. All right, first-person games. I'm sure you guys have seen these. These are seen through the eyes of the character in the game. So you might see your hands, you might see the lower half of your body, but you don't necessarily see your face. It is as if the camera itself was placed in the head of the character. Third-person games take place from usually over-the-shoulder camera view. So again, the camera is distanced away from the character itself, and you're able to see the majority of the character, and usually it's from the back. But you get a much clearer representation of who that character is and what that character looks like. Now, I would also argue that side-scrollers and top-down scrollers, or top-down shooters, also are third person, because the camera is abstracted away from the player. You can see what that character or ship or whatever it is looks like. Zelda games and other games like that fit very nicely in to the third person perspective. Now, God's eye view, again, I would argue are not third person, even though the camera might be in a similar position. There is no sense of one individual character in a God's eye view game, as you would get in a Zelda type game or any sort of top-down side-scrolling game where there's an active character playing. So we're going to take a look at a little bit about the difference between first and third person, and how that sort of informs the player's sense of self. So first person, again, you've got the camera in the head of the player. You might see the hands and other parts of the body. And there's definitely ways of adding narrative to those elements, to defining the character through those elements. The costuming, skin color, various sizes and shapes of the body, all sort of inform the idea of that character. But on the whole, it's quite easy to place yourself in that position. Even, in crazy post-apocalyptic shooters, in Doom, the latest Doom, you can still place yourself into that thing. It still feels like you because that camera is from your own viewpoint. Whereas a third-person game has this representation of a character, and that character could very distinctly not be you. It could be a different gender, it could be a totally different physical body, and you then have to make some sort of adjustments to your expectation of who the player is. And that's where things start to get really interesting. And that's where I want to start talking about the idea of performance. In these games, especially third-person games, you are performing a character. There's an expectation that you are you as a player, however, you are also you as the character in the game. And there's some really interesting ethical and social things that kind of come out of that. I recently replayed Firewatch, and it was very striking at the start of the game. When you're playing the game, even from the very start, I had a sense of, this is me. It's a first-person game. I'm playing through. I can easily identify with the male character kind of going through. But then, within the first 3 minutes, all of a sudden, you've got this portrait of who you are. And I remember it being a very distinct disassociation that I have. I mean, I guess you might argue that I personally look like this, but please. But either way, it was an immediate sense, like by placing this portrait so early on in the game, the makers of Firewatch wanted you to start performing as this character. They're forcing you to be, oh no, you are Henry now. You are not yourself anymore. You are Henry. And so it's asking you to start making decisions based upon the idea of being Henry. Okay, so I'm going to step back a little bit now and take a look at Tomb Raider, because Tomb Raider was a totally seminal game, and some really interesting things happened with this game. Up until that point, there were a lot of different sort of characters that people would identify with, but Tomb Raider was this really remarkable phenomenon in which a lot of people started identifying with the character itself. Lara Croft, who we can look at here. So this is from the original Tomb Raider. And I'm going to draw upon a little bit this idea of what's called the male gaze, which is this classic idea, and I'm going to break it apart a little bit. It's from Laura Mulvey. It's a really good read. I'll see if I can get some synopses to put up on the stream site, but I'm going to kind of break it down a little bit. And the idea of the male gaze kind of boils down to this idea of objectification, of an individual looking at something else or someone else and being able to objectify, to turn that person into an object as opposed to a human being. And that process of turning them into an object is to satisfy their own desires and needs by doing so. Now, in the original text, the male gaze, this was a 3-step process, and it was very much predicated on the idea of cinematic and film-based medium. And so we're going to take a look at how that changes when we look at game. So to break it apart, the 3-step process of the male gaze objectification was primarily from the camera. So at the time, there was a lot of men directors and men camera people. And so that first layer of the male gaze derived from the creative process, from actually creating the story, creating the framing, creating the actors, and capturing that element using the camera. The second layer was through character itself. So the male characters, the diegetic characters, also were objectifying and were consuming female characters within the diegetic story itself. And then the last step was the audience, the male audience being able to objectify the females as well throughout this whole process. So again, this is very much from a cinematic standpoint, and a lot of these ideas have sort of been broken apart a little bit and changed. Mulvey was writing in the mid-20th century, and so her ideas have changed, but it's still incredibly relevant to what we're talking about today. So to go back to Lara Croft, what we have here, if we were to apply that sort of template of the male gaze, is instead of the camera character audience, we've got a developer And then the audience and character get flipped a little bit, principally because the audience becomes the character. The audience is expected to be the character at the same time that the character is being the character. And this is something really different than what has ever happened before. It's this idea, again, that as a player, you're hearing the internal dialogue of the character. You're making decisions that the character is enacting. You have the potential to role play that character. And even if you don't choose to role play that character, the choices that you're making are imposed upon that character. And so effectively, you and the character kind of overlap in this weird Venn diagramish way. So coming back to Lara Croft, you become Lara Croft effectively in a lot of ways, which is really interesting because Lara Croft, you can't really tell from this image, but Lara Croft was at the time considered this amazingly hypersexualized character, with very narrow waist, like these outrageous proportions. And at the time, it was a phenomenon. But also at the time, it also had this strange tension between this hypersexualized character, but then the vast majority of people playing that character were also men. And in that performance, they were expected to perform this character of this hypersexualized female. And it was a very interesting sort of thing to watch, where, you know, half the time people were trying to get the best camera view or downloading mods to take her clothes off or whatever. At the same time, they were playing this character and they were identifying with this character and they were becoming the character. And it was a really interesting moment in character-driven narrative games, where this tension, which had existed beforehand, but this tension was really brought to the forefront. So to kind of wrap up this quick section, character-based games allow the player to both be themselves, but also to perform someone else. So at that point, who is the player? Is the player the character, or is the player playing the character? When you play a game, do you pick up on the cues that the designer is giving you as to who that character is, and do you perform that character, or are you performing yourself, just with this meat puppet character that you have going on? In addition, does the player make the decisions based upon what the character would do or what the player would do? And in the game, is there any particular difference between the two? Again, to go back to Tomb Raider, and this idea of this hypersexualized character, I love the fact that that wolf thing is sort of jammed into the corner. It's not working very well. But the ridiculousness of the whole situation is you can see that she was, you know, half the size of your thumb on a screen, and it wasn't really a big deal, but we'll take a look at how that expanded a little bit later on. But if you are playing this character, how far will you go to be that character? How far will you decide to be Lara Croft? And with that question, can you then objectify yourself? If the process of objectifying is taking the other and reducing them down to an object, if you are also that other at the same time, how does that work? And I can't answer that question, but I think it's a really, really interesting question. There are a couple other issues surrounding Lara Croft and Tomb Raider that I also want to bring up because there's some interesting things that come out of that. Okay, there was the movie. The Lara Croft movie, which if you've never seen it before, don't. It was awful. If you've seen it before, I'm sorry. But it took this idea, which is really interesting, of switching around the who the audience and who the character is and renormalizing that back into the traditional cinematic media. Super boring, super dull. It took out all the interesting parts of performativity, interaction, and choice. And the film itself was dross. But also, aside from that movie, Eidos was also hiring actresses to play Lara Croft, to be a stand-in for Lara Croft at conventions, in marketing. This particular actress, Nell McAndrew, was Lara Croft for several years. So she had the exclusive contract to be Lara Croft. And this contract was really interesting. She was not allowed to talk because she didn't have the right accent. She's smiling in this picture, but she was actively discouraged not to smile. And eventually she was booted out because she posed for Playboy. and which raises some ideas about choice in the greater world when you're performing a character. Does choices when you're performing a character outside of the character, do they influence your ability to be that character? In addition, there were other actresses who picked up the same role, one of whom kind of went a little nuts and decided to become Lara Croft, and she changed her name to Lara Croft, and Eidos sued her, and it was a real mess. But it breaks down this wall between the camera, character, audience, and it just becomes character and audience when this one person takes over this character, and performs that character even beyond the idea of a camera watching them at any given point in time. The audience is, of course, still watching this and seeing kind of what train wreck happens. In addition, fan art and other takes also kind of play around with this idea of camera, character, and audience. So instead, with fan art, instead of camera, character, audience, you kind of twist it around, and the audience starts becoming the character and the camera. The audience starts being able to manipulate the character and take ownership of it. Like there's no way the original designers of Eidos would want this to be the Lara Croft character. Yet at the same time, here he is. So fan art and the ability to take a designed character and make that character what you will beyond the original IP is a really interesting part of game that doesn't necessarily happen in normal media. We can also see this in cosplay, which is a fantastically interesting thing. And it kind of goes beyond this particular lecture because we're running up towards the end of part 1. But cosplay, even beyond fan art, really takes it and just smushes the whole thing up because you're performing the character and you are the audience, but you're also the camera, and the whole thing just gets really, really interesting. And the idea of the gaze, whether it's the male gaze or any sort of gaze, kind of gets twisted and becomes very interesting. And again, beyond the scope of this, but I'd be happy to talk about it. And if you want to raise these types of questions in the Discord chat, please do. I challenge you guys to post who the characters were that you really enjoyed being. Not necessarily looking at, but those characters that you were able to step into and become those characters and have some really interesting challenges with those characters. For me, the last one that I played that was really striking was Firewatch. Like immediately, again, that game asks you to be someone else. And through being that other person and performing as that other person, you get the most out of that narrative. Okay, I went a little over this for this particular one. We should have another one or two in this same idea. The next topic we're going to talk about is creation and the artistic intention behind the representation of self. Again, please go on to the Discord chat. Post those characters in those games that you really enjoyed becoming. And let's have a conversation. I'd be really curious to see who you guys liked to be. Okay, thank you very much.